Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into prayer?
Always.
We're looking at excerpts from the podcast, My God Hears My Prayer, Finding Solace in Divine Presence.
Interesting.
And it really got me wondering about something.
Oh.
What if God answers us in whispers? Not big booming pronouncements.
That is interesting.
Instead of shouting, it's more like,
Like quiet personal messages.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, I can see that.
The podcast uses Psalm 55.2
Okay.
and the translation from the message,
Right.
which says, come closer and whisper your answer.
You know, that's very different from other translations.
It is.
Like the New Catholic Edition and the Berean Study Bible.
Yeah, those are more traditional,
Not sure of that.
emphasizing that God hears our cries and pleas.
Right.
But the message,
It adds a whole other layer.
doesn't it?
That closeness, like God is sharing a secret with us.
It makes you think.
It does.
How do we picture God responding?
Right.
Is it a grand gesture, parting the clouds kind of thing? Or is it something much quieter, more personal?
That's such a good question.
And it's kind of at the heart of what the podcast explores.
Okay.
Those big ideas around prayer.
Oh, like what?
God's attentiveness,
Okay.
our constant searching,
Yeah.
and the intimacy prayer can bring.
And they tie that idea of attentiveness
Yes.
to the feeling that we're not alone,
Exactly.
even when things are quiet.
Desperate even.
Right, exactly.
But here's the thing that gets me.
What's that?
If God's always listening,
Right.
why do so many prayers feel like they go unanswered?
Yeah, that's the struggle, isn't it?
It is.
So many people wrestle with that.
I know I do.
You know, it's this tension.
In between what we're told.
Exactly, that promise of God being there,
Right.
always present.
And then on the other side,
The
of
reality
understand.
of being totally unheard.
totally.
It can make you wonder if you're doing something wrong.
Or if you're praying for the wrong things.
Exactly. Like, are we praying with the wrong expectations?
That's a good point.
Are we looking for a very specific outcome, or should we be more open?
To something more subtle.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like it.
Because the source material talks about this.
Okay.
This idea of finding peace and guidance through prayer.
Which is interesting because sometimes it doesn't feel peaceful at all.
You're right, it can be really hard.
But the source mentions Psalm 23.2.
Okay.
He leads me beside still waters.
Oh, that's such a beautiful image.
No, I love it.
Finding stillness.
When everything around you feels chaotic.
Right. It's like that sense of calm you get near a peaceful lake.
Yes.
Even when life feels like it's going crazy.
And the podcast suggests,
That by connecting with God in prayer,
yeah,
we can tap into that.
the inner peace.
That sense of calm that nothing can touch.
That's so powerful.
And the podcast includes a prayer reflection.
Okay, let's take a look.
All right, it starts with a plea.
Asking God to really see and hear the speaker.
To remove anything that stands between them.
So interesting how it directly asks.
To be led by the still waters.
And to be granted peace.
Yeah, it's like it's seeking that inner stillness.
We were just talking about.
Exactly.
And then goes on to ask for God's purpose.
To be fulfilled in their life.
Yeah, and to be freed from anything.
Hindering that purpose.
There's this line that really jumped out at me.
Which one?
Freed from every form of yoke and bondage.
Oh, wow.
Through the revelation of your word.
Powerful imagery, right? The
Very.
yoke, it's that heavy wooden frame.
Used to harness animals together.
Often for plowing.
Bondage, being held captive.
Restricted. Tied down.
So this line,
It's talking about the things that weigh us down.
the limitations that hold us back.
From fully living in God's purpose.
And it's not just physical.
No.
It's about anything holding us back.
Fear, doubt.
Past hurts.
And it's asking God to use his word to break those chains.
To understand his word and be set free.
That's a powerful thought.
And the reflection goes on to ask to be used to spread the gospel.
Which brings us back to that idea of faith in action.
Yes. From the source material.
It's not just about our personal relationship with God.
But how that relationship spills over into our actions.
How we interact with the world around us.
So if we believe that God hears us,
Even when we don't hear a response.
how does that change how we live our lives?
That's a good question to think about.
It is.
A really good question.
Because the podcast goes on to talk about this idea of overcoming silence.
Oh, yeah, those times when we pray.
And it feels like crickets.
Like nobody's home.
And it can be so discouraging.
It really can.
But the podcast encourages us to keep seeking
To keep knocking.
and to trust that God will answer.
He'll whisper back to us eventually.
There's that knocking metaphor again.
I know.
What do you think that means?
Well, knocking implies persistence, doesn't it?
It does.
You don't just knock once and walk away.
No.
You keep knocking till someone opens the door.
So we don't give up,
On that connection with God.
even when we feel discouraged.
Or like no one's listening.
And
But it's also about intimacy, I think.
okay, how so?
Well, you don't knock on a stranger's door.
You knock on the door of someone you know.
Someone you trust.
So it's like we're approaching God
With that same familiarity.
and confidence,
Yes. Knowing that he's there.
waiting to welcome us in.
Exactly.
That's a beautiful image.
But then that brings up another question.
What if we keep knocking and still no one answers?
What if we're straining to hear those whispers?
And all we get is silence.
Yeah, what then?
It's a tough one, for sure.
It is.
But, the podcast seems to be suggesting that maybe
Maybe.
the problem isn't that God isn't speaking,
Okay.
but that we aren't listening the right way.
That's an interesting thought, isn't it?
If God communicates in whispers,
What are we missing?
in all the noise and the chaos of our lives, what would it take to really listen,
What practices could we cultivate?
to develop a deeper sense of listening?
That's a great place to start, I think.
Maybe it's not about demanding answers.
But creating space for stillness.
To really be open to hearing what God might be saying.
Yes, I think there's something to that.
It's something to think about, for sure.
Definitely. It really makes you think
It does.
of all the noise we have in our lives.
All the distraction.
And how that might be drowning out those subtle messages from God.
Maybe we need to change how we think about prayer.
How so?
Instead of coming to God with our demands.
Right, like a shopping list.
Exactly.
What if we focused on the connection instead?
On just being present with God.
I think that's a really important point.
The podcast makes that point too.
It does.
Remember that line from Psalm 55.2?
Come closer and whisper your answer.
Yes. I really need you.
It's not just about asking for things.
It's more than that.
It's about expressing our need for God.
That dependence on something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly.
It's about being vulnerable.
Like the psalmist was.
Totally raw and honest with God.
I think that vulnerability is so important.
Right.
It's essential for intimacy.
Okay, I can see that. It's about letting go of pretense.
Being real.
Exactly. Just being ourselves with God.
That can be so hard, though.
It can.
Like, I always feel like I have to be perfect for God.
I think we all struggle with that.
Do we?
To some degree.
It's easier to come to God with a list
Right, with everything all neat and tidy.
than to actually open our hearts.
And share our doubts and fears.
Messy stuff.
Exact.
But maybe that's what real connection requires.
Embracing our imperfections.
Because God already knows them anyway.
He does, and the podcast seems to be suggesting that maybe God loves us not in spite of our flaws.
But because of them.
Yes, exactly.
You know, it's like when I think about my closest relationships.
The friends and family.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not when we're trying to impress each other. It's when we're being real.
Sharing our true selves.
That's when we connect on a deeper level.
I think that's a beautiful analogy.
It just came to me.
It's true, though.
Because true intimacy requires that vulnerability and authenticity.
Whether it's with God or with another person.
Exactly.
Okay, but what if you don't even know where to start?
With prayer.
Yeah, what if you don't have the words?
To express what you're feeling.
Or what you need?
It's okay to not have the words.
Is it?
Sometimes the most powerful prayers are the ones said in silence.
Wow.
It's about acknowledging God's presence.
Just being with him.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not about eloquence.
Or fancy words.
It's about the posture of our hearts
that deep personal connection.
that allows us to feel God,
And to hear his whispers.
even in the midst of all the busyness of life.
It makes you think about all the different ways.
People experience God.
Right. Some people feel God in nature.
Others, through music or art,
There's no one right way.
to connect with the divine
It's about finding what works for you,
and being consistent with it.
cultivating that relationship.
And maybe as we do that,
God's whispers become clearer.
easier to recognize amidst the noise.
Exactly.
This is all so helpful.
I'm glad to hear that.
So to recap,
Okay.
we've been talking about God whispering answers
Right.
and the tension between knowing God is there,
Always listening.
but feeling like our prayers aren't being answered.
And how we can cultivate intimacy in our prayer lives.
It's a lot to think about,
It is.
but I feel like we're starting to understand this better.
We are. And as we go deeper.
It's important to remember
What?
that faith is a journey.
Not a destination.
It's not a one-time thing.
No, there will be times of doubt.
Times when we feel lost.
Alone.
It's like anything worthwhile, I guess.
It takes effort
Patience
and a willingness to keep learning.
to keep growing.
And in those tough times,
Our faith is tested.
refined.
So even when we don't feel
They
God,
hear his whispers,
we can trust he's still there.
working in ways we don't always understand.
That's where faith comes in.
That unwavering belief.
That even in the silence
God is present.
and at work in our lives,
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how it all fits together.
Me too.
God whispering answers,
It encourages us to listen closely
to creating space for stillness,
and to nurture that connection with him. It also challenges us
to be open.
to the unexpected ways God might speak.
This has been so enlightening.
It is.
Thank you for helping me see all this in a new light.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could have this conversation.
I'm feeling really inspired
That's great to hear.
to approach prayer differently
With more intention.
and openness.
Remember, you're not alone on this journey.
So many people are looking for that connection with God
Wrestling with these same questions.
and finding peace in prayer.
It's a reminder that we're part of something bigger,
A community of seekers
united by that desire to connect.
with the divine.
And we each bring something unique to that community.
Our experiences,
Our questions,
they all add to a richer understanding.
of faith and prayer.
This has been a truly valuable conversation.
It has.
Thank you for your insights.
You're very welcome.
I feel like I've gained so much from this deep dive.
That's wonderful.
I'm feeling a renewed sense of curiosity
About what?
about prayer
That's great.
and a desire to go deeper in my own prayer life.
Yeah. And a new sense of hope, too. Like
Oh.
maybe I've been overthinking it.
Oh, thinking prayer.
Or making it more complicated than it needs to be.
It's easy to do, right?
It is.
Get caught up in the right way to pray.
The perfect words, the perfect setting.
But really, the podcast reminds us,
It's about opening our hearts to God.
wherever we are,
It's about that connection, right?
an ongoing conversation,
Not just a formal event.
but something constant.
You said earlier that silence isn't the absence of God.
Right.
It's an opportunity to listen deeper.
Exactly.
So for someone who wants to create more silence in their life,
What would you suggest?
what advice would you give?
It has to start with valuing silence.
Oh, okay.
We live in a world that's so loud,
Information overload.
constant stimulation.
Yeah, it takes effort to step away from that.
It does.
Find those quiet moments. You know, it's not just about scheduling prayer time.
But being mindful all day long,
Exactly.
like taking a moment to appreciate something beautiful,
Yes.
or taking a few deep breaths when things are stressful.
Those are great examples.
It's about being present,
Oh, wait.
noticing those little ways God might be trying to reach us.
I love that.
But what about when we're really struggling, when we need guidance or comfort?
That's when those quiet spaces become even more important.
Even more.
Even if it's just for a few minutes a day,
Okay.
find a place where you can be alone.
With your thoughts.
With God.
A quiet corner.
A walk in nature.
Even just sitting in your car for a minute.
Before you start your day.
It's like creating a sanctuary
A sacred space.
where you can intentionally shut out the noise.
And focus on connecting with God.
I'm getting so much from this conversation.
Good. I'm glad.
It's given me a whole new perspective on prayer
That's what we hope for.
and a better understanding of how to build a relationship with God.
It's a journey, you know.
It is.
There will be times when you feel close to God.
And times when you feel distant.
Times when his whispers are clear.
And times when there's only silence.
But even in the silence.
God is there.
And he hears our prayers.
Maybe in the silence we discover new ways of listening.
New ways of experiencing God.
And new ways of growing our faith. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And to our listeners,
Yes.
we hope you found this exploration of prayer as enriching as we have,
Maybe you've learned something new.
or been inspired to try something different in your own prayer life,
And if you're feeling lost,
or unsure.
remember what the podcast said.
Remember, you are not alone. Keep knocking, and he will whisper back.
Beautiful.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Keep seeking, keep knocking, and keep listening for those whispers of truth.